Hello everyone, I am the Boring Historian, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The last thing Wei remembered was the crushing pressure of water against his chest, the panic of drowning in the Yangtze River during what should have been a routine archaeological survey. Then darkness, then light, blinding, disorienting light. He awoke gasping on a dirt path, his modern clothes gone, replaced by rough-spun cotton garments that scratched against his skin. Around him, the familiar skyscrapers of 21st century Nanjing had vanished. Instead, he found himself on the outskirts of what appeared to be an ancient Chinese city, its walls rising formidably in the distance. Wei Lu had studied Imperial Chinese history for years as a professor at Beijing University. He had written papers on Tang Dynasty social structures, lectured on Ming Dynasty governance, and researched Qing Dynasty economics. But academic knowledge was one thing, living it was another entirely. As he gathered his wits, a cart rumbled past, the driver barely glancing at him. Two women carrying baskets walked by, their bound feet forcing them into an unnatural, painful gait. They lowered their eyes as they passed him. In the distance, he could see farmers bent double in rice paddies, their backs curved like bows from decades of labor. A group of soldiers marched along the city wall, their armor glinting in the sun. And high above, from the tallest building in the city, clearly the governor's residence, flew a flag bearing the symbols of the Ming Dynasty. Impossible, Wei thought. I've somehow been transported to Imperial China. Little did he know that surviving even a single day in this world would test everything he thought he knew about his ancestors' civilization, and everything he thought he knew about himself. Wei's first instinct was to find shelter and gather information. As he approached the city gates, he noticed the guards scrutinizing everyone who entered. They wore the distinctive uniforms of Ming Dynasty soldiers, layered armor, conical helmets, and each carried a sword at his hip and a spear in hand. Papers, barked one guard as Wei approached. Wei froze. Papers? What papers would he have? He had nothing but the clothes on his back. I lost them, Wei stammered, realizing too late that his accent sounded strange, his modern Mandarin noticeably different from the Ming-era dialect. The guard's eyes narrowed. Where are you from? Beijing, Wei said automatically, then winced. It wouldn't be called Beijing in the Ming era, but rather Dadu or Khanbalik if this was early Ming, or perhaps Jingxi if later. The guard's hand moved to his sword. You mean Jingxi? Your accent is strange. Are you a foreign spy? A Japanese pirate? Wei's heart pounded. His first interaction in this world, and already he faced suspicion that could lead to imprisonment or worse. No, Wei said quickly. I am from Henan province. I was robbed on the road. Bandits took everything. The second guard laughed. Another country fool comes to the city with tales of woe. Next you'll be begging in the streets. He stepped closer, his breath hot and sour against Wei's face. The magistrate has ordered a crackdown on vagrants. Without papers or a patron in the city, you have no business here. Wei thought quickly. I have come to seek employment with Scholar Zhang. I am a scribe and learned man. The guards exchanged glances. Invoking the name of a scholar was risky. If they knew no such person existed, Wei would be in trouble. But the gamble paid off. Scholar Zhang has a compound in the eastern quarter, the first guard said, his suspicion not entirely gone. But you should know he takes only the most skilled calligraphers, and those who have passed at least the county-level examinations. Wei nodded gratefully. Thank you for your guidance. You still need papers to enter, the guard insisted. Or you need to pay the entry tax. Entry tax. Of course, Wei had nothing of value except He checked his wrist automatically and was shocked to find his watch still there. A modern stainless steel timepiece would be worth a fortune here, but would also immediately mark him as something impossible to explain. "I have nothing to pay with," Wei admitted. The guards conferred briefly. "The city needs laborers for the new granary construction," one said finally. 3 days' work will earn you temporary papers. Report to the labor master inside the east gate. It wasn't ideal, but it was a way in. Wei nodded his acceptance, and the guards waved him through, marking his palm with a character in black ink, the sign of an indentured laborer. As he passed through the massive gates, the full sensory assault of Imperial China hit him. The smell came first, a powerful mixture of human waste, animal dung, cooking fires, incense, and the body odor of thousands living without modern sanitation. The streets were narrow and crowded, filled with people shouting, animals braying, and vendors hawking their wares. Wei's eyes watered from the smoke of countless cooking fires. A pig ran squealing down the street, pursued by a butcher with a cleaver. 2 men argued violently over the price of rice, nearly coming to blows. Somewhere, a baby wailed incessantly. As he made his way toward the east gate, Wei passed a public punishment taking place in a small square. A man was kneeling, his hands bound behind him, while an official read out his crimes. A crowd had gathered to watch. For the crime of failing to pay his taxes for 3 consecutive seasons, the official announced, Liu Bowen is sentenced to 30 strokes of the bamboo. 2 guards forced the man to lie flat on his stomach. They pulled down his pants, exposing his buttocks. A 3rd guard approached with a long bamboo rod. The first stroke landed with a sickening crack. The man screamed. Blood appeared instantly. By the 5th stroke, the man's buttocks were a mass of torn flesh. Wei turned away, nauseated. He had read about judicial corporal punishment in Imperial China, but witnessing it was entirely different. The casualness of the brutality, the public nature of the humiliation, and the fact that the crowd watched with expressions ranging from satisfaction to indifference shocked him deeply. This is justice here, Wei thought with growing horror. And failing to pay taxes is considered a relatively minor offense. He hurried away, trying to block out the continuing screams. The labor master's station wasn't difficult to find. A crowd of desperate-looking men had already gathered around a stern official seated at a table. Wei joined the line, watching as each man ahead of him was assessed for strength and assigned a task. When his turn came, the labor master looked him up and down with critical eyes. "You don't look like you've done a day's hard labor in your life," the man said, poking Wei's relatively soft professor's body. "What skills do you have?" "I can read and write," Wei said. "I am educated." The labor master raised an eyebrow. "Then why are you looking for manual labor?" "I was robbed on the road. I need to earn enough to establish myself." The labor master considered him. "We need someone to keep records of the grain deliveries. Can you count?" Wei nodded eagerly. "Yes, very well. You'll assist Foreman Lin. 3 days' work and you'll get your temporary papers. Try to run and you'll get 50 strokes of the bamboo. Understand?" Wei nodded again. It was his first stroke of luck since arriving in this world. Record keeping would be far easier than hauling stones or digging foundations. As the labor master wrote out his assignment on a slip of paper, Wei realized something critical. He needed to find shelter for the night. The sun was already lowering in the sky, and he had no money for an inn. "Where do the laborers sleep?" he asked cautiously. The labor master laughed. "Sleep? You think the city provides beds? Find yourself a spot in the alley behind the granary with the other vagrants. Be at the site by first light or you'll forfeit a day's credit." With the assignment slip clutched in his hand, Wei made his way through the increasingly crowded streets. People jostled him from all sides. A woman emptied a chamber pot from a second-story window, the contents splashing perilously close to his feet. Two children ran past, their faces covered in sores that looked like smallpox. Smallpox. The thought hit Wei like a physical blow. In this era, deadly diseases ran rampant. Smallpox, plague, cholera, dysentery. He had none of the immunizations that would protect someone born in this time, whose immune system had adapted to these constant threats. Even a minor cut could lead to infection and death without antibiotics. By the time he reached the granary construction site, the sun was setting. True to the labor master's word, a group of ragged men had already claimed spots in the alley behind the half-constructed building. Some had thin mats or pieces of cloth to lie on. Others would sleep directly on the hard-packed dirt. Wei found an unoccupied corner and sat down, his back against the wall. His stomach growled painfully. He hadn't eaten all day. Across the alley, an old man was chewing on what looked like a piece of dried fish. The smell made Wei's mouth water. "Excuse me," Wei called softly. "Do you know where one might find food?" The old man looked up, his eyes suspicious. "You new to the city?" Wei nodded. "They don't feed you for labor duty," the man said. "You need to bring your own food or buy it with your wages, which you won't get until you've completed your assignment." "Then how do people eat?" Wei asked, desperation creeping into his voice. The old man shrugged. "Some beg, some steal, some go hungry." He hesitated, then broke off a small piece of his fish and held it out. "Here, but don't expect more tomorrow." Wei took the morsel gratefully. "Thank you for your kindness," the old man grunted. "Not kindness, insurance. Hungry men steal. I'd rather give a little than lose it all while I sleep." As darkness fell completely, the temperature dropped rapidly. Without modern heating, the spring night became bitterly cold. Wei huddled against the wall, shivering. Around him, the other laborers coughed and wheezed, many clearly ill with respiratory diseases. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by the sounds of the city. Drunken shouts, a woman's scream, the clatter of the night watch making their rounds. Twice, Wei jerked awake when rats scurried across his legs. In the darkest hours before dawn, it began to rain, a cold, penetrating drizzle that soon had Wei soaked to the skin. There was nowhere to take shelter, nothing to cover himself with. He sat there, teeth chattering, as the rain turned the alley to mud. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten, Wei was exhausted, hungry, and miserable. The other laborers stirred around him, rising stiffly from their uncomfortable beds. No one complained about the rain or the cold. This, Wei realized with a sinking feeling, was simply normal life for them. He joined the line of men shuffling toward the granary site. Armed guards watched them carefully, counting heads and checking assignment slips. Wei presented his to a surly foreman, who pointed him toward a small shelter where an older man sat with brushes, ink, and bamboo tallying sticks. "You the new record keeper?" the man asked without looking up. "Yes," Wei said, relieved to be out of the rain. "I'm Foreman Lin. You'll record each delivery of grain, the source and the quality. Make a mistake, and it's your hide. Understand?" Wei nodded. "I understand." For the next several hours, Wei recorded deliveries as farmers and merchants brought sacks and carts of grain to the granary. His hand cramped from using the unfamiliar brush and ink, but his years of academic work made the task manageable. What wasn't manageable was his growing hunger and thirst. By midday, Wei's head was pounding, and he felt lightheaded. Foreman Lin seemed to notice. "First day's always the hardest," he said, not unkindly. He reached into his robe and pulled out a small rice ball wrapped in a leaf. "Here, can't have you fainting and spilling ink everywhere." Wei accepted the food with profound gratitude. "Thank you, sir." The foreman waved away his thanks. "You write well. better than most who come through here. Were you a scholar's apprentice before you fell on hard times? Wei sensed an opportunity. Yes, I studied Jingxi for many years. Lin's eyebrows rose. Then why are you here doing labor duty? Bad fortune, Wei said simply. I hope to find a position in a scholar's household, or perhaps prepare for the examinations. Lin studied him thoughtfully. My nephew is preparing for the county examinations. He needs someone to help him practice his essays. Wei's spirits lifted. I would be honored to assist him. Complete your 3 days here first, Lin said. Then we'll see. By sunset, Wei's back ached from sitting hunched over the record books all day. His eyes strained in the dim light, but he had established a potentially valuable connection and secured one meal. It was progress, however small. That night in the alley, Wei found himself less of an outsider. The old man who had shared his fish nodded in recognition. Another laborer offered Wei a sip from a flask of cheap rice wine. As he settled against the wall again, preparing for another uncomfortable night, Wei reflected on his first full day in Imperial China. He had survived, barely, but he had also begun to understand the harsh realities of this world in a way his academic studies had never conveyed. Physical comfort, privacy, sanitation, safety, abundant food, all the things he had taken for granted in the modern world were luxuries here, available only to the wealthy and powerful. For ordinary people, life was a constant struggle for bare subsistence, and Wei had only experienced the mildest taste of that struggle so far. He shuddered to think what would happen if he fell seriously ill, ran afoul of the law, or couldn't secure more permanent employment after his labor duty ended. As he drifted into an uneasy sleep, one thought kept returning. How long can I survive in a world where life is so easily lost and suffering is so casually inflicted? Wei's second day at the granary began before dawn. His body ached from sleeping on the hard ground, and his stomach cramped with hunger. The persistent dampness had settled into his joints, making every movement painful. Worst of all, his throat felt scratchy, the first sign of what could become a serious illness in this pre-antibiotic world. Foreman Lin noticed Wei's condition immediately. You look terrible, he said bluntly as Wei took his seat at the record table. Just tired, Wei replied, not wanting to admit weakness. Lin grunted skeptically but said nothing more. The morning's deliveries began, and Wei focused on his task, trying to ignore his discomfort. By midday, however, Wei was struggling. His headache had intensified, and he felt feverish. Several times he had to ask merchants to repeat information, earning suspicious looks. Take a break, Lin ordered finally. Go wash your face in the water barrel. You're no use to me if you collapse. Wei nodded gratefully and made his way to the barrel behind the shelter. The water was cloudy and had debris floating in it, but he had no choice. He splashed it on his face, then after a moment's hesitation, took a small sip to ease his parched throat. A mistake, he would later realize. In his modern life, Wei had never had to worry about waterborne diseases. Here, untreated water could be deadly. When he returned to his post, a commotion was underway. A well-dressed merchant was arguing with Foreman Lin, his face red with anger. This delivery is half of what was promised, Lin was saying, pointing at a cart piled with rice sacks. The magistrate will hear of this. The floods took half my crop, the merchant protested. I cannot deliver what I do not have. That is not the city's concern, Lin replied coldly. Your tax obligation remains the same. Then take everything, the merchant cried, gesturing wildly at his cart. Take it all and leave my family to starve. Lin signaled to the guards. Record it, he told Wei. Merchant Liu Deming, rice delivery, 50% shortfall. Note his claim of flood damage. Wei wrote quickly, conscious that his record would be used to determine the merchant's punishment. The man watched him with desperate eyes. "Please," Liu said quietly to Wei. "My youngest daughter is only 4. If they take all the rice, she will not survive the winter." Wei hesitated, brush hovering over the paper. What should he write? The truth, which would likely doom the merchant's family, or a lie, which might save them but would put himself at risk? Before he could decide, Lin snatched the record from him. "I'll finish this one," he said sharply. "You're too soft-hearted." The merchant was led away by guards, his protests fading as he was taken to face the magistrate's judgment. Wei sat, stunned by the casual cruelty of the system and his own powerlessness to affect it. "You would not have lasted long in this position," Lin said when the merchant was gone. "Compassion is a luxury for officials. For men like us, it is a liability." Wei nodded mutely, understanding for the first time the moral compromises required for survival in this world. His academic knowledge of Imperial Chinese bureaucracy hadn't prepared him for the human cost of its rigid enforcement. As the afternoon wore on, Wei's condition deteriorated. His fever rose and a persistent cough developed. By the time the day's deliveries ended, he could barely stand. Lin regarded him with concern. "You've taken ill," he stated. "The night air will make it worse." Wei didn't argue. The prospect of another night in the damp alley terrified him. Without modern medicine, a simple cold could progress to pneumonia and death. "I have a small room behind my house," Lin said after a moment's consideration. "My nephew stays there when he visits from his village. You can use it tonight, better than dying in an alley." Wei wanted to weep with gratitude. "Thank you, Foreman Lin. I don't know how to repay such kindness." Lin waved away his thanks. "It's not kindness. You write well, and I need someone to help my nephew. Dead men can't teach calligraphy." Wei followed Lin through the crowded streets as dusk fell. The city transformed at night. Lanterns cast eerie shadows. Revelers spilled from tea houses, and figures lurked in doorways, watching passers-by with predatory eyes. Lin's home was in a modest neighborhood of single-story dwellings packed tightly together. The house itself was small, but well-maintained, with a tiny courtyard at its center. "My wife died 3 winters ago," Lin explained as he led Wei to a shed-like structure at the back of the property. "It's just me now. The room isn't much, but it's dry." The room was indeed humble, barely large enough for a sleeping mat and a small table. But to Wei, it looked like paradise compared to the alley. "Rest," Lin instructed. "I'll bring soup." Left alone, Wei sank onto the mat, exhausted. His academic career had not prepared him for the physical demands of life in Imperial China. Even those in relatively privileged positions, like record-keeping, lived with hardships that would be considered intolerable in the modern world. Lin returned with a bowl of thin soup and a cup of bitter-smelling tea. "Drink the tea first," he said. "It will help with the fever." Wei obeyed, forcing down the astringent liquid. The soup was little more than hot water with a few vegetables and a hint of dried fish, but it was the most substantial meal he'd had since arriving in this world. "Thank you," Wei said again, returning the empty bowl. Lin studied him curiously. "Your speech is strange. Your accent, it's not from any province I know." Wei tensed. His modern Mandarin was noticeably different from Ming Dynasty speech patterns. "I traveled widely as a scholar's assistant," he said vaguely. "Perhaps my accent reflects that." Lin didn't look convinced, but he didn't press the issue. "Sleep now. Tomorrow is your final day of labor duty." After Lin left, Wei lay on the mat, staring at the ceiling. His fever made his thoughts wander. How long would he be trapped here? Would he ever see the modern world again? And if not, how would he build a life in this harsh reality? Sleep eventually claimed him, but it was filled with feverish dreams of modern hospitals just out of reach, of execution grounds where the condemned wore his face, of of endless examinations where the questions kept changing. He woke to Lin shaking his shoulder. "It's time," the foreman said. "Can you work today?" Wei sat up, assessing his condition. The fever had broken during the night, though he still felt weak and his cough persisted. "Yes," he said, "I can work." Lin nodded approvingly. "Good. One more day, and you'll have your papers." At the granary, Wei settled into his now familiar position. The work proceeded smoothly until mid-morning, when a commotion erupted near the main gate. A procession was approaching, an ornate sedan chair carried by 4 servants flanked by guards in fine uniforms. The workers all stopped to bow deeply as the procession passed. "The magistrate," Lin whispered to Wei. "Look down, do not meet his eyes." Wei bowed his head like everyone else, but he couldn't resist glancing up as the sedan chair came to a halt near their shelter. The curtains parted, and a middle-aged man in elaborate official robes emerged. His face was stern, his bearing imperious. "Foreman Lin," the magistrate called. "Report on the granary's progress." Lin hurried forward, kowtowing 3 times before speaking. "Honored magistrate, construction proceeds according to schedule. The foundation is complete and the walls rise daily. Grain collection has met 70% of expected volume." The magistrate frowned. "Only 70%? The Emperor's tax collectors will arrive in 1 month. The full quota must be met." "Yes, Excellency," Lin said, head still bowed. "However, the floods in the eastern districts have reduced yields significantly. Then collect more from the western districts." The magistrate said dismissively, "I will not report a shortfall to the provincial governor." "The western farmers have already given their full share," Lin said, his voice careful. "To take more would leave them without seed for next season." The magistrate's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Are you questioning my authority, Foreman Lin?" Lin prostrated himself immediately. "No, Excellency. I merely report the difficulties so that your wisdom may overcome them." The magistrate seemed mollified by this display of submission. "Very well. Increase the quota for merchants bringing grain from neighboring prefectures. If they complain, remind them that their trading licenses depend on the magistrate's goodwill." "It will be done, Excellency," Lin assured him. The magistrate turned to go, then paused, his gaze falling on Wei. "Who is this? I don't recognize him." Wei froze, unsure how to respond. Fortunately, Lin answered for him. "A temporary worker, Excellency, completing his labor duty for entry papers." The magistrate studied Wei with cold eyes. "He does not look like a laborer." "He is educated," Lin explained. "He keeps our records." "Educated?" The magistrate's interest sharpened. "Stand up, man. Let me see you." Wei rose slowly, keeping his eyes lowered as protocol demanded. His heart pounded in his chest. "Your name?" the magistrate demanded. "Wei Lu, Excellency." Wei answered, his voice steady despite his fear. "You have studied the classics?" "Yes, Excellency. The 4 books and 5 classics." The magistrate made a sound of surprise. "Recite the opening passage of the Great Learning." Wei silently thanked his university education as he began to recite. "The way of the Great Learning consists in manifesting one's bright virtue, consists in loving the people, consists in stopping in perfect goodness." "Enough," the magistrate interrupted. "Your accent is peculiar, but your knowledge seems sound." He turned to Lin. "When his labor duty is complete, send him to my compound. My son requires a tutor who knows the classics." With that, the magistrate returned to his sedan chair, and the procession continued on its way. Lin stared at Wei with new respect. "It seems your fortunes have improved dramatically," he said when they were alone again. "A position in the magistrate's household is no small opportunity." Wei nodded, still processing what had just happened. "What is the magistrate's son like?" he asked cautiously. Lin's expression turned guarded. "It is not my place to comment on my superiors," he said formally. Then, lowering his voice, "But I will say this, the young master is known for his difficult temperament. His previous 3 tutors lasted less than a month each." Wei's momentary elation faded. Being noticed by a powerful official could be as dangerous as it was beneficial in Imperial China. The magistrate's favor was conditional and could be withdrawn at any moment. And a difficult student from an elite family could make Wei's life miserable, or worse, if he felt insulted or challenged. "I'm sure I can adapt to the young master's needs," Wei said carefully. Lin gave him a knowing look. "Just remember, in the magistrate's household, the walls have ears, and a wrong word can cost you your head. Be humble, be useful, and above all, be careful." The rest of the day passed in a blur, Wei's mind racing with the implications of his new position. When sunset came, Lin presented him with his temporary entry papers, a simple document with his name, occupation listed as tutor, and the magistrate's seal. "These are valid for 1 month, Lin explained. "After that, you'll need the magistrate's formal appointment to remain in the city legally." Wei tucked the precious papers into his robe. "Thank you for everything, Foreman Lin." Lin smiled slightly. "Perhaps you can still help my nephew with his studies sometime." "I would be honored," Wei replied sincerely. That night, Lin allowed Wei to stay in the small room again. "Rest well," the foreman advised. "Tomorrow you enter a different world, one with silken robes and poisoned cups. The magistrate's household is like a miniature imperial court, with all the intrigue that implies." As Wei lay on the sleeping mat, contemplating his future, he realized that his academic knowledge of Imperial Chinese society was being transformed into visceral understanding. The rigid hierarchy, the constant fear of authority, the network of obligations and connections that determined one's fate, these weren't just historical concepts anymore, but the scaffolding of his daily reality. And tomorrow, he would climb higher on that scaffolding, into the rarefied air of the official class. The view might be better, but the fall would be longer and harder. Just survive one day at a time, Wei told himself as sleep approached. Learn the rules, play the game, and maybe, somehow, find a way home. But even as he formed the thought, he wondered if home was still possible, or if this ancient world was now his permanent reality. The magistrate's compound stood in the city's administrative district, surrounded by a high wall topped with ceramic tiles glazed in imperial yellow. 2 stone lions guarded the main gate, their snarling faces warning visitors of the power that resided within. Wei approached hesitantly, his temporary papers clutched in hand. The guards at the gate regarded him with suspicion. "State your business," one demanded. "I am Wei Lu," he said, bowing. "The magistrate instructed me to present myself as a potential tutor for the young master." The guards exchanged glances. One took Wei's papers and examined them carefully before returning them with a nod. "Wait here," he ordered, then disappeared through a side door. Wei stood uncomfortably under the remaining guard's scrutiny. His cough had improved slightly, but he still felt weak, and his clothes, the same rough garments he'd worn for 3 days, were dirty and sweat-stained. Hardly the appearance of a scholarly tutor. After what seemed an eternity, the guard returned with an older man dressed in the robes of a household steward. "You are Wei Liu?" the steward asked, his voice clipped and formal. Wei bowed. "Yes, honored steward." The man looked him up and down with obvious distaste. "The magistrate mentioned you might appear. I am Steward Zhao, manager of the household." He sniffed. "You will need to be cleaned up before meeting the young master. Follow me." Wei followed Zhao through the gate and into a world utterly different from the crowded, dirty streets outside. The compound was a series of courtyards connected by covered walkways, each more elegant than the last. carefully pruned gardens featured ornamental rocks and flowing water. Servants moved purposefully between buildings, their eyes downcast as they passed their superiors. Zhao led Wei to a small building near the servants' quarters. "You will bathe here," he said, gesturing to a wooden tub. "Then you will be given appropriate clothing. Your current attire will be burned." Wei bowed again. "Thank you, Steward Zhao." The steward's expression remained cold. "Do not thank me. The magistrate has ordered this, so it must be done. But understand your position clearly. You are here on approval. If the young master finds you unsuitable, you will be dismissed immediately." With that warning, Zhao left Wei in the care of 2 male servants, who efficiently prepared a bath with heated water, a luxury Wei hadn't experienced since arriving in this world. The feeling of hot water on his skin was so wonderful, he nearly wept. After bathing, Wei was given a scholar's robe of plain blue cotton, modest compared to the silks worn by the household's permanent members, but infinitely finer than his previous garments. His hair was combed and arranged in the proper top knot, secured with a wooden pin. When the preparations were complete, Steward Zhao returned to inspect him. "Adequate," he pronounced. "Now, before you meet the young master, you should understand something. Master Li is the magistrate's only son. His mother died birthing him 16 years ago. He has failed the preliminary examinations twice already, bringing shame to his father. You are the 4th tutor this year. The others were found incompetent." Wei absorbed this information carefully. What were their failings? Zhao's mouth tightened. The first was too strict and dared to report the young master's laziness to the magistrate. The second was too lenient and allowed the young master to neglect his studies entirely. The third claimed illness and fled the city after just 3 weeks. In other words, Wei thought, one was dismissed by the father, one by the son, and one escaped while he still could. "I understand," Wei said aloud. "A tutor must balance discipline with understanding." Zhao gave him a piercing look. "You understand nothing yet, but you will." He gestured for Wei to follow him again. "The young master is in the garden pavilion. He has been informed of your arrival." They walked through several more courtyards, each more lavish than the last, until they reached an exquisite garden with a small pavilion at its center. A slender young man sat at a table there, idly tracing characters on paper with a brush. He didn't look up as they approached. "Young master," Zhao announced, bowing deeply. "The new tutor, Wei Liu, presents himself for your approval." Wei dropped to one knee and performed a formal bow, touching his forehead to the ground once as appropriate for a scholar addressing a superior's son. The young man finally looked up, his expression one of bored contempt. "Another country scholar come to recite the classics at me," he said. "How tedious." Wei remained silent, head bowed, waiting for permission to rise. "Get up," Master Li said impatiently. "Let me see what my father has inflicted on me this time." Wei rose and stood with his hands clasped, eyes respectfully lowered but not completely downcast. The proper posture for a tutor who was subordinate but not servile. Master Li studied him critically. "You're younger than the others," he observed, "and your accent is strange. Where are you from?" "Originally from Henan province, young master," Wei said, sticking to his established story. "But I have traveled widely." Li made a dismissive sound. "Traveled widely, yet ended up doing labor duty at a granary. Not very impressive." Wei sensed the test in these words. Too much humility would mark him as a man without pride in his learning. Too much defense of his status would be seen as arrogance. "Fortune's wheel turns for all men, young master," Wei replied carefully. "Yesterday I recorded grain deliveries. Today I have the honor of discussing the classics with the magistrate's son. Who knows what tomorrow may bring?" A flicker of interest crossed Li's face. poetic at least. The last one just stammered apologies when I insulted him. He waved a hand. "Steward Zhao, leave us. I will test this new tutor's knowledge myself." Zhao bowed and retreated, leaving Wei alone with the young master. Li gestured to the seat across from him. "Sit. Let us see what you know." Wei sat, maintaining perfect posture as was expected of a scholar. "Recite the opening paragraph of the Analects," Li commanded. Wei did so flawlessly, his university training serving him well. "Now explain the meaning, as if I were a child," Li said, a challenge in his voice. Wei considered how to respond. He could give the standard interpretation that any Ming Dynasty scholar would offer, safe but dull. Or he could share a more nuanced analysis that might engage this clearly intelligent but rebellious young man. He chose the riskier path. The passage tells us that learning must be practiced continuously to be valuable, Wei began. But more importantly, it suggests that true joy comes not from external validation, like passing examinations to please one's father, but from the internal satisfaction of genuine understanding, and from applying that understanding with friends who share one's passion for knowledge. Li's eyes widened slightly. "Are you suggesting I should not care about passing the examinations?" Wei smiled slightly. "Not at all, young master. I am suggesting that if you find joy in learning itself, passing the examinations will follow naturally, and you might even find the process less tedious." For a moment, Li stared at him, expression unreadable. Then he laughed, a genuine sound of surprise and delight. "Well played, Teacher Wei. You've managed to both flatter and challenge me in the same breath." Wei bowed his head modestly. "I merely offered my understanding of the text." "No," Li said, suddenly serious. "You did something none of the others dared. You spoke to me as a person, not just as the magistrate's son." He leaned forward. "Tell me, Teacher Wei, do you actually believe what you just said about learning? Or was it merely a clever response designed to win my approval?" Wei met the young man's eyes directly. "I believe it with all my heart. Knowledge pursued only for advancement is hollow. Knowledge pursued for its own sake is transformative." Li studied him for a long moment, then nodded decisively. "You will do, I think. At least you're not as dull as the others." He stood abruptly. "Come, I'll show you where you'll stay. The last tutor's quarters should still be prepared." Wei followed Li through the garden to a small but elegant building set apart from the main family residence. Inside was a simply furnished room with a proper bed, a writing desk, and shelves containing numerous scrolls and bound books. "These will be your quarters," Li said. "We will begin lessons tomorrow morning. I am expected to pass the prefectural examinations in 3 months. My father has made it clear that failure is not an option for either of us." The threat was thinly veiled, but Wei understood it perfectly. His position, and possibly his life, depended on Li's success. "I will do everything in my power to ensure you are prepared, young master," Wei promised. Li's expression softened slightly. "I believe you might actually mean that." He turned to leave, then paused. "One more thing, Teacher Wei. My father will expect you to join us for the evening meal today. It is a test of sorts. Be prepared." After Li left, Wei explored his new quarters with a mixture of relief and apprehension. The room represented luxury beyond anything he had experienced since arriving in this world. Clean bedding, privacy, shelves of books, even a small brazier for heat. But it was also a gilded cage, one where his every word and action would be scrutinized for impropriety. He examined the books on the shelves, classic texts that any imperial tutor would be expected to know intimately. The 4 books, the 5 classics, histories, poetry collections, and guides to the examination system. Wei felt a surge of gratitude for his modern university education, which had required him to study these works extensively. As he settled at the desk to refresh his memory of key passages, a servant appeared at the door with a tray of food, a bowl of rice, vegetables in a light sauce, and a small portion of chicken. After days of near starvation, the meal seemed like a feast. The steward instructed me to inform you that evening rice will be served in the main hall at the hour of the dog, the servant said formally. Appropriate attire has been placed in the cabinet. Wei thanked him and returned to his studies, acutely aware of the precariousness of his position. The magistrate's dinner would be his first real test, a public examination of his manners, knowledge, and suitability. As evening approached, Wei changed into the formal attire provided, a scholar's robe of higher quality than the one he'd worn earlier, with subtle embroidery at the collar and cuffs. He arranged his hair carefully, aware that even the smallest detail of his appearance would be judged. A servant arrived to escort him to the main hall, guiding him through a maze of courtyards and corridors. The compound was far larger than Wei had initially realized, a miniature city within the city, housing not just the magistrate's family, but dozens of servants, clerks, and guards. The main hall was imposing, high ceilings supported by massive wooden columns, walls adorned with calligraphy scrolls, and lanterns casting a warm glow over the assembled company. The magistrate sat at the head of the central table, with young Master Li to his right. Several other officials, likely the magistrate's secretaries and advisors, occupied the remaining seats. Wei was directed to a smaller side table, where Steward Zhao and a few higher-ranking servants sat. His placement was deliberate, close enough to be called upon for conversation, yet clearly separate from the main party, reinforcing his ambiguous status as neither family nor servant, but something in between. "The new tutor arrives," the magistrate announced, his voice carrying across the hall. "Come forward, Scholar Wei." Wei approached and performed the appropriate bow, 3 full prostrations and 9 head knockings for an official of the magistrate's rank. "Rise," the magistrate commanded. "You present yourself well for a man recently engaged in labor duty." "Your Excellency honors me with his notice," Wei replied, keeping his eyes respectfully lowered. "My son tells me you have an interesting perspective on the classics," the magistrate continued. "Perhaps you would enlighten us with your interpretation of Mencius's view on human nature?" The question was a common one in scholarly circles, but loaded with potential pitfalls. Wei chose his words carefully. "Mencius teaches us that human nature is inherently good, like water naturally flowing downward," Wei began. "Yet just as water can be forced to flow upward with sufficient pressure, humans can be corrupted by negative influences. This view supports the importance of proper education and righteous governance, to allow people's natural goodness to flourish under wise leadership." The magistrate nodded slightly. "And how does this view compare with that of Xunzi?" Xunzi believed human nature is inherently evil and must be constrained through ritual and education, Wei replied. Where Mencius saw education as nurturing existing virtue, Xunzi saw it as creating virtue where none naturally exists. "And your own view?" the magistrate pressed. This was dangerous territory. Too original an interpretation might mark Wei as unorthodox. Too conventional a response would be boring. "I believe both sages capture partial truths," Wei said. "Like Mencius, I see the potential for goodness in all people. Like Xunzi, I recognize that this potential must be cultivated through discipline and proper instruction. The wise ruler, therefore, provides both nurturing conditions and clear boundaries, trusting in people's capacity for virtue while acknowledging their vulnerability to corruption." A murmur ran through the assembled officials. The magistrate's expression remained neutral, but young Master Li looked impressed. "Well reasoned." The the magistrate said finally. Now tell me, what do you consider the most essential quality for a government official to possess? Another test question, and one with serious political implications. Wei thought of the merchant facing punishment for failing to deliver his full rice quota, of the casual brutality of the bamboo punishment, of the suffering he had witnessed in just a few days in this world. Benevolence, Your Excellency, Wei answered. As Confucius taught, the virtuous ruler sees the people as his children. Without benevolence, righteousness becomes cruelty, wisdom becomes cunning, and loyalty becomes blind obedience. A tense silence followed this statement. Had he gone too far, implying that officials, perhaps even the magistrate himself, might lack benevolence? The magistrate studied him for a long moment, then smiled thinly. A traditional answer, but delivered with conviction. You speak as if you have witnessed the consequences of governance without benevolence. One need not experience fire personally to understand that it burns, Your Excellency, Wei replied carefully. The magistrate laughed unexpectedly. Diplomatically said, You may return to your seat, Scholar Wei. We shall observe your progress with my son with interest. The remainder of the meal passed without Wei being directly addressed again, allowing him to observe the interactions around him. The magistrate dominated the conversation, with his officials offering careful agreement to his every pronouncement. Young Master Li remained largely silent, speaking only when directly questioned by his father. The food served was elaborate by Ming Dynasty standards. Multiple dishes of vegetables, fish, and meat, prepared with expensive spices and presented artfully. Wei ate sparingly, conscious of proper etiquette and the watching eyes of the other diners. As the meal concluded, the magistrate rose, prompting everyone else to stand immediately. Scholar Wei, he said as he prepared to leave, I expect weekly reports on my son's progress. The prefectural examinations allow no room for failure. Understand? Wei bowed deeply. I understand completely, Your Excellency. After the magistrate departed, the atmosphere in the hall relaxed noticeably. Officials who had been formal and reserved began to talk more freely, some calling for wine to be served. Young Master Li approached Wei as servants cleared the tables. You survived, Li observed with a hint of amusement. Not everyone does. My father can be intense. The magistrate is clearly concerned for your success, Wei replied diplomatically. Li snorted. The magistrate is concerned for his reputation. My success or failure reflects on him. He lowered his voice. Walk with me in the garden. There are too many ears here. Wei followed Li out into a moonlit garden, where the young man led him to a secluded bench beside a small pond. I must know something, Li said when they were alone. Your interpretations of the classics, they're unusual. Not wrong or unorthodox enough to cause offense, but different somehow. Where did you study? Wei tensed. This line of questioning could quickly become dangerous. I had several teachers with diverse perspectives, he said vaguely. Li wasn't satisfied. Your accent is strange too, not like any province I know. And sometimes you use phrases that sound off. Wei's mind raced for a plausible explanation. My primary teacher was an eccentric scholar who had traveled beyond China's borders, he improvised. He incorporated ideas from foreign philosophies into his interpretations of our classics. Perhaps some of his peculiarities have influenced my speech and thought. Li studied him with intelligent eyes. A foreign-influenced teacher, he repeated skeptically. That would explain some things, I suppose. He seemed to make a decision. I don't think you're being entirely truthful, Teacher Wei, but I also don't think you mean any harm. So I will make you an offer. Help me pass the examinations, and I won't inquire too deeply into your mysterious background. Wei bowed his head in acknowledgement. A fair arrangement, young master. Good, Lee said, rising. We begin at dawn tomorrow. I should warn you, I am not a diligent student. The classics bore me, the examination system seems arbitrary, and the idea of spending my life as an official like my father fills me with dread. But I have no choice in the matter. Perhaps, Wei suggested carefully, we can find aspects of the material that might engage your interest more naturally. Lai looked skeptical but nodded. You can try. Others have failed. He turned to go, then added over his shoulder. By the way, be careful with Steward Zhao. He reports everything to my father, and he resents scholars on principle. He has arranged the dismissal of at least one previous tutor. With that warning, Li left Wei alone in the garden, contemplating the complex power dynamics of the household he had entered. Every relationship seemed fraught with hidden tensions and competing agendas. The magistrate wanted a successful son to enhance his reputation. Li wanted freedom from his father's expectations. Steward Zhao wanted to maintain his influence over the household, and everyone watched everyone else, looking for advantages or vulnerabilities to exploit. As Wei made his way back to his quarters, he reflected on how the political intrigues of the magistrate's compound mirrored Imperial China's larger social structure. Trust was a luxury few could afford. Alliances shifted constantly, and one's position was never truly secure. Even the magistrate himself served at the pleasure of higher officials who could recall or demote him at any time. In his room, Wei found that a servant had lit the small brazier, taking the chill from the night air. A pot of tea waited on his desk. These small comforts reminded him of how quickly his circumstances had changed, from sleeping in a muddy alley to enjoying private quarters in an official's compound. But the comforts came with golden chains. One misstep, one careless word, one failure with young Master Li, and Wei could find himself not just dismissed, but possibly imprisoned or worse. The magistrate had the power of life and death over everyone in his jurisdiction, a power Wei had seen exercised casually with the merchant who couldn't deliver his full rice quota. Wei poured himself tea and opened one of the examination preparation books. Tomorrow he would begin the delicate task of engaging an unwilling student while navigating the treacherous politics of an elite household. His survival depended on his success. As he studied into the night, preparing for his first formal lesson with Li, Wei wondered about the modern world he had left behind. Did time pass differently there? Were people looking for him? Or had that reality ceased to exist for him the moment he awakened on that dirt path outside the city? Such questions had no answers. For now, his reality was here, in a world where life was precious and precarious, where authority was absolute, and where even the most privileged walked a knife's edge between favor and disgrace. Dawn broke over the magistrate's compound, painting the tiled roofs with golden light. Wei had been awake for hours, reviewing the standard examination curriculum and planning his approach to teaching young Master Li. A servant arrived with a simple breakfast: rice porridge, pickled vegetables, and tea, and the message that the young master would meet him in the study pavilion when the morning meal was complete. Wei ate quickly, then gathered the books he had selected for the first lesson. As he made his way through the compound, he noted how different it looked in the early morning light. Servants scrubbing courtyards, gardeners tending plants, kitchen staff hurrying with baskets of fresh produce. Behind the elegant facade of an official's residence lay a small army of workers whose labor maintained the appearance of effortless refinement. The study pavilion stood in a quiet corner of the compound, a hexagonal structure with open sides that could be closed with bamboo screens in poor weather. Inside, a large desk held writing materials, brushes, inkstones, and sheets of fine paper. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with bound volumes and scrolls. Young Master Lee arrived late, his hair hastily arranged and dark circles under his eyes suggesting a night of poor sleep, or perhaps indulgence. "Good morning, young master," Wei greeted him with a formal bow. Lee yawned. "Is it? I find mornings rarely have much to recommend them." He dropped onto the cushion behind the desk with little grace. "So, Teacher Wei, how do you propose to accomplish the impossible task of preparing me for the examinations?" Wei seated himself more formally across from his student. "First, I would like to understand what you already know and where you feel least confident." Lee shrugged. "I can recite the 4 books and 5 classics. I can compose the required 8-legged essays in the proper form. I can write acceptable poetry in multiple styles." He traced a pattern on the desk with his finger. "What I cannot do, apparently, is impress the examiners. May I ask what feedback you received on your previous attempts?" Wei inquired. Lee's expression darkened. "My essays were deemed technically correct but lacking in moral insight. My poetry was competent but without true feeling. In other words, I know the words but not the music." He looked up at Wei challengingly. "Can you teach music to someone who hears only noise?" The question revealed more about Lee's state of mind than perhaps he intended. Behind the arrogance and resentment lay genuine frustration, and perhaps fear of continued failure. "I believe I can," Wei said carefully, "but not by having you memorize more texts or practice more essay structures. Instead, we must help you find personal meaning in the material." Lee looked skeptical. "Personal meaning? The examiners don't care about my personal views. They want orthodox interpretations delivered in perfect form." "True," Wei acknowledged. "But a writer who believes in what he writes produces work with a quality that transcends mere technical correctness. The examiners may not be able to define this quality precisely, but they recognize it when they see it." Lee considered this. "And how do you propose to help me find this personal connection to materials I find irrelevant to actual life?" Wei smiled slightly. "By showing you their relevance." He opened one of the books he had brought, the Analects of Confucius. "Let's begin with something concrete. Confucius says here that a superior man understands righteousness, while a small man understands profit. Do you agree?" Lee's answer was immediate and dismissive. "Of course. The superior man acts according to moral principles rather than self-interest." Standard interpretation. "I see," Wei said. "And your father, the magistrate, when he ordered the granary built and the rice collected, was he acting from righteousness or concern for profit?" Lee's eyes widened slightly at the directness of the question. "That's a complex situation." "Indeed," Wei agreed. "The granary serves many purposes. It ensures the city won't starve if crops fail. It fulfills the magistrate's obligation to the imperial government. It demonstrates his effective administration, and it secures his position. Righteousness and profit intertwine." He leaned forward, suddenly engaged. "You're suggesting the distinction isn't as clear as Confucius claims?" "I'm suggesting," Wei said carefully, "that applying these principles to real situations requires nuanced thinking. The examination system tests your ability to navigate this complexity while maintaining proper respect for traditional interpretations." For the next 2 hours, Wei led Lee through selected passages, always relating them to concrete situations the young man might recognize from his own life or observations. Rather than lecturing, Wei asked questions that forced Lee to think critically about the texts, while being careful to always circle back to orthodox conclusions that would satisfy examination requirements. By mid-morning, Lee was actively participating, arguing positions and even challenging Wei's interpretations, exactly what Wei had hoped for. Engagement was the first step toward genuine understanding. As they concluded the session, Lee sat back with a thoughtful expression. That was not entirely boring, he admitted. Wei smiled. High praise indeed. For tomorrow, please compose an 8-legged essay on the relationship between righteousness and profit, as discussed in the Analects. But before you write the formal essay, I want you to write your own personal thoughts on the topic. Just for yourself, not for my review. Lee raised an eyebrow. Personal thoughts? Not part of the examination format. Consider it preparation, Wei explained. Write what you truly believe first. Then translate those genuine insights into the required format. I think you'll find the resulting essay has more of the quality the examiners are seeking. Lee seemed dubious but nodded. I'll try your method. He rose to leave, then paused. My father has invited guests for dinner tonight, officials from the provincial capital. You will be expected to attend. Wei bowed his acknowledgement, recognizing both the opportunity and danger such an event presented. Impressing higher officials could secure his position. Making a misstep could destroy it. After Lee departed, Wei spent the afternoon in the compound's library, refreshing his knowledge of current political affairs. As a history professor in the modern world, he knew how events had unfolded during the Ming Dynasty, which factions had ultimately prevailed, which policies had succeeded or failed. But he couldn't reveal such knowledge without raising dangerous suspicions. Instead, he needed to understand the political landscape as it appeared to those living through it. The debates, personalities, and shifting alliances that dominated court politics and trickled down to provincial administration. The library contained official gazettes and reports that gave him a clearer picture of the current situation. The Ming Dynasty was in its middle period, facing challenges from northern border tribes and dealing with factionalism at court. The emperor was increasingly withdrawing from direct governance, leaving eunuchs and ministers to battle for influence. These distant court politics had direct implications even for a provincial magistrate. Aligning with the wrong faction could end a promising career. Backing the right patron could lead to promotion and wealth. No wonder the magistrate was anxious about his son's examination success. It represented not just family honor, but potential political advancement. As Wei was returning to his quarters to prepare for the evening banquet, he encountered Steward Zhao in one of the courtyards. The steward stopped him with a raised hand. "Scholar Wei," Zhao said, his tone formal but his eyes cold. "I trust you are finding your accommodations satisfactory?" Wei bowed politely. "Most satisfactory, honored steward. The magistrate's generosity is boundless." "Indeed." Zhao studied him critically. "The young master seemed engaged after your lesson today. An unusual occurrence." "I am pleased to hear it," Wei replied neutrally. "You should understand something," Zhao continued, stepping closer. "The young master has had many tutors. Some were more qualified than you, with recommendations from prestigious academies, yet they failed. The magistrate has limited patience for failure." The threat was thinly veiled, but Wei maintained his composure. "I appreciate your concern, honored steward. Rest assured, I am fully committed to the young master's success." Zhao's eyes narrowed. "See that you are." Tonight's dinner includes the Provincial Education Commissioner. He will certainly question you about your background and qualifications. I hope your answers satisfy him. With that parting warning, Zhao continued on his way, leaving Wei with a knot of anxiety in his stomach. The Education Commissioner would be familiar with all the major scholars and academies. Wei's vague story about studying with an eccentric, foreign-influenced teacher might not withstand expert scrutiny. He returned to his quarters to find new clothing laid out, formal scholars' robes of higher quality than what he had worn the previous evening. The magistrate was clearly presenting him as a fully credentialed tutor, not a fortunate laborer who had caught his attention. As Wei dressed, he reviewed his fabricated background story, adding plausible details while being careful not to create contradictions. The key was to remain vague about specifics, while projecting absolute confidence in his knowledge of the classics and examination requirements. When a servant came to escort him to the banquet hall, Wei followed with outward calm that belied his inner tension. The hall had been transformed since the previous evening. Lanterns of red silk cast a festive glow, tables were arranged in a formal pattern according to rank, and servants stood ready with trays of elaborate dishes. The magistrate sat at the head table with an older man in the robes of a high provincial official, presumably the education commissioner. Young Master Li sat to his father's left, looking uncomfortable in formal attire. Other tables held local officials of various ranks, arranged according to strict protocols of precedence. Wei was directed to a middle table, a step up from his placement the previous night, suggesting the magistrate was acknowledging his status as a scholar rather than a servant. He sat quietly, observing the complex social dynamics playing out around him. The banquet began with a series of toasts, each official rising to honor the magistrate and the visiting commissioner with increasingly flowery language. Wine flowed freely, served in small cups that were constantly refilled. Wei drank sparingly, aware that intoxication could loosen his tongue dangerously. After several courses had been served, the magistrate stood and addressed the gathering. Honored Commissioner, esteemed colleagues, I wish to introduce the newest member of my household. Scholar Wei Liu has taken on the important task of preparing my son for the prefectural examinations. All eyes turned to Wei, who rose and performed the appropriate bow. Scholar Wei, the commissioner called, his voice carrying the authority of his rank. Approach and tell us something of your background. Wei moved forward and knelt at the appropriate distance from the high official's table. This humble scholar is honored by your attention, Excellency, he began, using the formal language expected in such situations. Where did you receive your education? The commissioner asked directly. My primary teacher was Master Huang of Henan Province, Wei replied, citing a name he had invented that morning. After his passing, I continued my studies independently, focusing on the interpretation of the classics as they apply to effective governance. The commissioner's eyes narrowed slightly. Master Huang, I am not familiar with his work. He was a reclusive scholar, Excellency, Wei explained smoothly. He believed that true wisdom required distance from worldly affairs. His teachings emphasized finding practical applications for the ancients' wisdom. I see, the commissioner said, not entirely convinced. And you have authored works yourself? Only modest commentaries, Excellency, Wei said with appropriate humility. My focus has been on education rather than publication. The commissioner turned to the magistrate. An unusual choice for your son's tutor, Magistrate Hu. Previous scholars came with well-established reputations. The magistrate smiled thinly. Previous scholars failed, Commissioner. Sometimes fresh perspectives yield better results. The commissioner nodded thoughtfully, then addressed Wei again. Scholar Wei, what is your approach to preparing a student for the examinations? Wei chose his words carefully. The perfect examination answer must demonstrate not just knowledge of the classics, but a deep understanding of their moral implications. I believe this understanding comes most naturally when a student sees how the ancient wisdom applies to real governance challenges. Theory illuminated by practice, if you will. The commissioner raised an eyebrow. An interesting approach, somewhat unorthodox but not without merit. He lifted his wine cup. To your success, Scholar Wei, The magistrate's son carries the honor of our province when he sits for the examinations. Wei bowed deeply, recognizing the implicit warning in the commissioner's toast. Li's performance would reflect not just on his father, but on the entire provincial education system that the commissioner oversaw. As Wei returned to his seat, he caught young Master Li's eye. The young man gave him the slightest nod, a silent acknowledgement that Wei had navigated the dangerous questioning successfully. The remainder of the banquet passed in a blur of rich food, political conversations thinly disguised as philosophical discussions, and careful maneuvering for position and favor. Wei observed how each official sought to impress the commissioner, while appearing not to seek his approval too obviously. The social choreography was as complex as any court dance, with potentially deadly consequences for those who missed a step. By the time the banquet concluded, Wei was mentally exhausted from the constant vigilance required to maintain his persona. The physical comfort of the magistrate's compound came at the cost of perpetual performance, a stark contrast to the honest misery of his days as a laborer. As he was returning to his quarters, young Master Li intercepted him in a corridor. "Well played with the commissioner," Li said quietly. "He's known for trapping scholars in contradictions, but you gave him nothing to grasp." "Thank you, young master," Wei replied. "I hope I didn't embarrass you or your father." Li waved away the concern. "Quite the opposite. The commissioner was impressed enough to mention you specifically to my father after you left." His expression grew serious. "But be careful. Your success tonight has made you visible and possibly threatening to some in this household." Wei nodded his understanding. "I will proceed with caution." "See that you do," Li said. "Oh, and I've been thinking about your assignment, the personal reflection before writing the formal essay. It's an unusual approach, but," he hesitated, then finished reluctantly, "I find myself curious to try it." Wei smiled slightly. "I look forward to seeing the results, young master." As Li walked away, Wei reflected on how quickly the young man was warming to his teaching methods. Creating a genuine connection between Li and the material he studied might actually help him pass the examinations, and by extension, secure Wei's position in the household. But that security would always be conditional, dependent on continuing to navigate the treacherous waters of elite society in Imperial China. One misstep, one powerful enemy, one piece of bad luck, and Wei could find himself back on the streets, or worse. In his quarters, Wei found a small package on his desk, a gift from the magistrate, according to the accompanying note. Inside was a set of writing brushes of the finest quality, with handles of polished bamboo and tips of soft wolf hair. The gift represented approval, but also increased expectations. Wei ran his fingers over the brushes, thinking of how differently time flowed in this world compared to modern life. In 21st century academia, progress was measured in semesters and publications. Here, one's status could transform overnight, from laborer to tutor to favored scholar, or from respected advisor to disgraced prisoner. Wei placed the brushes carefully in the desk drawer. Tomorrow would bring another lesson with Li, another opportunity to secure his position. Another day of performing a role that was both familiar, the scholar, and utterly foreign, the Ming Dynasty tutor. As he prepared for bed, Wei thought again of the modern world he had left behind. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his career studying Imperial Chinese society, and now he was living within it, experiencing firsthand the structures and pressures he had analyzed academically. What would my colleagues think if they could see me now? He wondered. Would they envy my direct access to the history we studied? Or would they pity me for being trapped in a world where life is so precarious and freedom so limited? The question had no answer. For now, Wei could only continue his day-by-day adaptation to this new reality, using his historical knowledge as a guide, while being careful never to reveal its true source. He extinguished the lamp and lay in darkness, listening to the night sounds of the compound. Distant voices, the clack of the night watchman's wooden blocks, the rustle of trees in the garden. Despite his comfortable bed and full stomach, sleep came slowly, haunted by awareness of how quickly fortune's wheel could turn in Imperial China, especially for a man with secrets to keep. The routine of daily life in the magistrate's compound gradually became familiar to Wei. Each morning began before dawn with the sounds of servants preparing the household for the day, sweeping courtyards, lighting kitchen fires, drawing water from wells. A young boy would bring Wei a basin of warm water for washing, followed by a simple breakfast of rice porridge and tea. Mornings were devoted to lessons with young Master Li, focusing on the classics and essay composition. Afternoons might include poetry practice, history discussions, or calligraphy sessions. In the evenings, Wei sometimes joined the magistrate's table for dinner, though more often he ate alone in his quarters, using the time to prepare for the next day's lessons. The physical comforts of his position were undeniable. He no longer went hungry or slept in the cold. His quarters were clean and private. His clothing was appropriate to his station. These basic necessities, which he had taken for granted in the modern world, now seemed like precious luxuries. Yet even with these comforts, Wei found the physical realities of life in Imperial China taking a toll on his body. Without modern dentistry, his teeth ached constantly from the gritty rice that formed the basis of every meal. Without eyeglasses, the strain of reading by lamplight left him with frequent headaches. Without modern medicine, minor ailments that he would have treated with over-the-counter remedies in his previous life now lingered for weeks. On this particular morning, Wei woke with a throbbing pain in his lower back, the result of sitting for hours in the formal posture required during lessons and meals. In the modern world, he might have taken an anti-inflammatory medication and stretched on a yoga mat. Here, he had no choice but to endure the pain and maintain the perfect posture expected of a scholar. As he made his way to the study pavilion for the day's lesson with Li, Wei passed through a courtyard where the magistrate was meeting with local officials. The conversation reached him in fragments. Unprecedented flooding in the eastern districts. Granaries nearly full, but winter will be harsh. Reports of bandits on the northern roads. Wei slowed his pace slightly, gathering information. Resource scarcity, natural disasters, and security concerns shaped everyday life in ways that historical records couldn't fully convey. The magistrate's decisions in response to these challenges would affect thousands of lives, including Wei's own. The meeting dispersed as Wei passed, and the magistrate noticed him. "Scholar Wei," he called. "A moment." Wei approached and bowed deeply. "Your Excellency, my son speaks well of your teaching methods," the magistrate said, studying Wei closely. "He seems engaged in his studies for the first time." "The young master has a quick mind," Wei replied carefully. "I merely try to channel his intelligence toward the examination requirements." The magistrate nodded. "Continue your efforts. The prefectural examinations are only 2 months away now." He hesitated, then added, "The commissioner was impressed by your knowledge at the banquet. He has suggested that after the examinations, you might be suitable for a position in the Provincial Education Bureau." Wei bowed again, recognizing both the compliment and the pressure it represented. "I am honored by the commissioner's notice, but my focus remains entirely on preparing the young master for success." "As it should be," the magistrate agreed. He gestured dismissal, and Wei continued to the study pavilion, his mind racing with the implications of this conversation. A position in the Provincial Education Bureau would represent a dramatic rise in status, from anonymous laborer to government official in a matter of months. Such rapid advancement was rare in the rigid hierarchy of Imperial China, where most men spent decades working toward positions of modest authority. But the offer was conditional on Li's examination success. If the young man failed, Wei's prospects would evaporate instantly. The magistrate was offering a carrot to complement the stick of potential punishment. Wei found Li already waiting in the pavilion, bent over a sheet of paper covered with elegantly brushed characters. "Good morning, young master," Wei greeted him. "You're early today." Li looked up, a hint of excitement in his eyes. "I completed both assignments, the personal reflection and the formal essay. The method you suggested, it had merit." Wei seated himself, hiding his surprise at Li's enthusiasm. "I'm pleased to hear it. May I see the results?" Li handed him the formal essay first, an 8-legged composition on righteousness versus profit that followed all the structural requirements while incorporating genuine insights about the practical applications of moral principles in governance. "This is excellent work," Wei said sincerely. "Your arguments are orthodox enough to satisfy traditional examiners, but thoughtful enough to stand out from routine responses." Li tried to look nonchalant, but Wei could see he was pleased by the praise. "The personal reflection helped," he admitted. "Writing my true thoughts first made it easier to find a path through the formal structure without losing the essence of my ideas." "Exactly the intended effect," Wei said. "May I see the personal reflection as well?" Li hesitated. "It's rather candid. I wrote it only for myself, as you suggested." "Then it should remain private," Wei assured him. "The purpose was to help you connect personally with the material, not to have another person judge your private thoughts." Li relaxed visibly. "Thank you for understanding." He rolled up the personal reflection and tucked it into his sleeve. "What will we study today?" Wei had planned a session on historical precedents in governance, but the conversation he had overheard in the courtyard suggested a more immediately relevant topic. "I thought we might discuss how the classics address natural disasters and their impact on governance," Wei suggested. "It seems the eastern districts are experiencing flooding." Li's expression turned serious. "Yes, 3 villages were completely destroyed last week. The survivors have been coming to the city," but he trailed off. "But?" Wei prompted. "But my father has ordered the city gates closed to refugees without resources," Li finished, his voice tight. "He says the city cannot support them all, that disease and crime would follow if they were admitted." Wei chose his words carefully. A difficult decision. What do the classics suggest about such situations? Li frowned thoughtfully. Mencius would say the people's welfare is the foundation of stable governance. To abandon starving peasants seems contrary to benevolent rule. Indeed, Wei agreed. Yet Xunzi might argue that order must be maintained for the greater good, that emotional decisions could lead to greater suffering for all. "So which is right?" Li demanded, a hint of frustration in his voice. "What is the correct answer for the examinations?" "The examinations would expect you to balance these perspectives," Wei explained. "To acknowledge the moral imperative of compassion while recognizing the practical challenges of limited resources." Li's eyes flashed. "That's no answer at all. Real people are suffering and dying, while scholars debate theoretical balance." Wei recognized the passion behind Li's outburst, the natural human response to witnessing suffering that academic discussions often obscured. It was a sentiment he had encountered among his university students in the modern world, when historical atrocities felt too abstract. "You're right," Wei said simply. "People are suffering. The academic answer feels hollow in the face of that reality." Li looked surprised at this validation. Then what is the point of all this study if it doesn't provide real answers to real problems? Perhaps, Wei suggested, the study itself isn't meant to provide answers, but to prepare your mind to seek them in specific situations. The classics offer principles, not prescriptions. Li considered this. So how would you address the refugee situation, Teacher Wei? Not as a scholar reciting ancient texts, but as a person with your own judgment. It was a dangerous question. Criticizing the magistrate's policies could end Wei's newfound security instantly. But dismissing Li's moral concern could damage the trust they were building. If I were advising your father, Wei said carefully, I might suggest a middle path. Perhaps the city could establish a temporary settlement outside the walls where refugees could receive basic aid while being screened for disease. Those with skills needed in the city might be admitted gradually. Those able to work could help strengthen the flood barriers to prevent future disasters. Lai nodded slowly, a practical compromise that acknowledges both moral duty and resource limitations. He smiled slightly. A very examination-friendly answer after all, Teacher Wei. Wei returned the smile. The best examination answers reflect thoughtful approaches to real governance challenges. The ancients valued wisdom applied to specific situations, not just recitation of principles. Their discussion continued, moving from theoretical considerations to practical applications. Wei guided Li through the classical texts that addressed natural disasters, showing how historical officials had balanced immediate compassion with long-term stability. By the session's end, Li seemed energized rather than drained, a marked contrast to his usual post-lesson lethargy. As they gathered the books and writing materials, Li paused. My father mentioned you this morning, he said casually. He seems pleased with my progress. I'm gratified to hear it, Wei replied, equally casual. He also mentioned the commissioner's interest in you. Li's tone remained light, but his eyes were serious. A position in the Provincial Education Bureau would be a significant advancement. Wei arranged the brushes carefully in their case. My focus remains on your examination preparation, young master. Of course, Li agreed, but it's worth considering what comes after. Provincial positions open doors to the capital. From there, who knows? The Hanlin Academy itself might not be beyond reach for a scholar of your capabilities. The casual mention of such prestigious possibilities demonstrated Li's familiarity with the bureaucratic advancement system that governed elite careers in Imperial China. Every ambitious family mapped out potential paths to power, calculating which positions, patrons, and accomplishments might lead to the highest possible rank. The future will unfold as heaven intends, Wei said diplomatically. Li laughed. Now you sound like a proper Confucian scholar, but I've noticed you're more practical than many. He lowered his voice. I've been thinking about your suggestion regarding the refugees. I might mention some elements of it to my father. Wei felt a flicker of alarm. Young master, I wouldn't presume to. Don't worry, Li interrupted. I'll present it as my own idea, inspired by my studies. My father expects me to develop administrative judgment as well as scholarly knowledge. After Li departed, Wei remained in the pavilion, contemplating the young man's growing confidence. Li was beginning to see himself as a future official rather than just a reluctant examination candidate. That evolution represented real progress, but also increased risk if Wei's influence was seen as too significant. As Wei was returning to his quarters, he encountered a group of servants rushing toward the main gate, carrying medical supplies. Curious, he followed at a discreet distance. At the gate, a crowd had gathered around a man who had collapsed on the ground. From the quality of his clothing, he appeared to be a merchant or minor official rather than a peasant. The man's face was flushed with fever, and he was struggling to breathe. "Stand back," ordered the compound's physician, an elderly man with a wispy beard. "He shows signs of the lung fever." A ripple of fear passed through the assembled servants. Lung fever, pneumonic plague, was greatly feared for its rapid spread and high mortality rate. "He must be isolated immediately," the physician continued. "Prepare the quarantine building." Servants hurried to obey, though their movements betrayed their terror of coming too close to the sick man. Wei watched with a cold knot of dread in his stomach. In the modern world, pneumonic plague was treatable with antibiotics. Here, it was often a death sentence, not just for the infected individual, but potentially for everyone who came in contact with him. "Scholar Wei," a voice said behind him. Wei turned to find Steward Zhao watching him with calculating eyes. "You should return to your quarters. This is no concern of yours." "Of course, honored steward," Wei replied, bowing slightly. "I was merely passing by." "The situation is under control," Zhao said firmly. "There is no need for the young master or his father to be troubled with this minor incident." Wei understood the implicit instruction. Do not mention this to Li or the magistrate. The steward was attempting to manage the situation quietly, perhaps to avoid panic, or to prevent the magistrate from blaming him for allowing a potentially infected person into the compound. "I understand completely," Wei assured him. Zhao studied him for a moment, then nodded. "The physician is highly skilled. There is no cause for concern." As Wei walked away, he wondered if the steward actually believed his own reassurances. Epidemic disease was one of the greatest killers in pre-modern societies, sweeping through communities with devastating effect. Even the wealthy and powerful were vulnerable, perhaps especially vulnerable, as their households contained many servants who moved between the compound and the city, potentially carrying disease back with them. In his quarters, Wei washed his hands thoroughly in the basin of water. A modern health habit that looked like simple cleanliness to others but might help protect him from infection. He wished desperately for soap, alcohol sanitizer, antibiotics, any of the modern tools that made infectious disease manageable rather than catastrophic. Over the next few days, a tense atmosphere pervaded the compound. Servants whispered about more cases of lung fever in the city. The sick man had been moved to an isolated building near the outer wall, attended only by the physician and 2 servants who had been exposed during his collapse. Wei continued his lessons with Li, neither of them mentioning the situation directly. But Wei noticed extra precautions being taken throughout the household, meals being served with individual portions rather than shared dishes. Incense burning constantly in every room, believed to purify the air, and servants washing the floors with vinegar water. On the 3rd day after the merchant's collapse, Wei was summoned unexpectedly to the magistrate's private study, a rare occurrence that set his heart racing with apprehension. The magistrate sat behind his desk, looking more haggard than Wei had seen him previously. Steward Zhao stood nearby, his expression unreadable. "Scholar Wei," the magistrate said without preamble, "I understand you witnessed the merchant's collapse at the gate." Wei bowed. "Yes, Excellency." "And you observed the physician's assessment." "I did, Excellency." The magistrate exchanged glances with Zhao. "The physician has now fallen ill with the same symptoms, as have the 2 servants who attended the merchant." Wei felt a chill run through him. If the trained physician had succumbed despite taking precautions, the disease was indeed virulent. "I have been informed," the magistrate continued, "that you have shown unusual knowledge of health practices. Servants report that you wash your hands frequently and avoid touching your face. You declined to share dishes at meals even before this incident." Wei tensed. His modern hygiene habits, practiced automatically, had been noticed and remarked upon. "Simple cleanliness, Excellency," he said carefully. "Perhaps, or perhaps deeper knowledge." The magistrate leaned forward. "I care nothing for your secrets, Scholar Wei, if your knowledge can help protect this household, and particularly my son. The city is now experiencing multiple cases of lung fever. 3 officials have already died." Wei realized he was being asked, or rather ordered, to share any medical knowledge he possessed. The risk of revealing too much of his modern understanding had to be balanced against the opportunity to potentially save lives, including his own. "I am no physician, Excellency," Wei began cautiously, "but I have studied historical accounts of similar outbreaks. The fever appears to spread through close contact, particularly through the breath. Isolation of the sick is essential, but so is protection for those who must care for them." "Protection? What form of protection?" the magistrate asked sharply. Wei thought quickly about what materials might be available. Cloth masks soaked in vinegar and dried, covering the nose and mouth. Frequent washing of hands and changing of garments after contact with the ill. Burning the belongings of the deceased rather than preserving them. The magistrate nodded slowly. "These measures align with some the physician recommended before he fell ill. What else?" Wei hesitated, then continued. "The disease may have come from the flood refugees, forced to live in crowded, unsanitary conditions. While the city gates must remain controlled, establishing a proper camp with clean water and adequate food might reduce the spread of disease among them, and consequently to the city." It was a calculated risk to return to the refugee issue, but Wei saw an opportunity to address both the humanitarian crisis and the disease outbreak with a single recommendation. The magistrate's eyes narrowed. "You suggest the same approach my son proposed yesterday? Did you perhaps discuss this matter with him?" Wei bowed his head. "We discussed theoretical approaches to natural disasters, Excellency. The young master is developing excellent administrative judgment." This answer seemed to please the magistrate. "Indeed, he shows promise." He rose from behind his desk. "I have decided to implement both the protective measures you describe and the refugee camp my son suggested. You will work with Steward Zhao to organize the household's response to this crisis." Wei bowed deeply, surprised by this assignment that took him far beyond his role as tutor. "I will do my utmost, Excellency." "See that you do," the magistrate said grimly. "If this disease claims my son, those responsible for his protection will answer with their lives." The threat hung in the air as Wei was dismissed. Outside the study, Steward Zhao regarded him with a mixture of resentment and calculation. "The magistrate puts great faith in your foreign knowledge," Zhao said quietly. "I hope it proves justified." "As do I, honored steward," Wei replied. "Shall we begin organizing the protective measures immediately?" The next week passed in a blur of activity. Wei's regular lessons with Li were reduced to make time for his new responsibilities. The compound was effectively sealed, with only essential deliveries permitted through the gate. Every member of the household, from the magistrate to the lowest kitchen boy, was required to wear a cloth mask when in shared spaces. Wei worked with the compound's seamstresses to produce hundreds of these masks, insisting on multiple layers of cloth soaked in vinegar between washings. He established hand-washing stations throughout the compound and ordered all communal eating vessels replaced with individual portions. The hardest part was organizing care for the growing number of sick. The original quarantine building quickly filled, requiring the conversion of a storage facility at the farthest corner of the compound. Wei trained a team of servants in protective measures, showing them how to minimize direct contact while still providing necessary care. Throughout these efforts, Wei was acutely aware of walking a dangerous line. He needed to share enough of his modern understanding of disease transmission to be effective, without revealing knowledge impossible for even the most learned Ming Dynasty scholar to possess. When questioned about the source of his ideas, he attributed them variously to foreign medical treatises, historical accounts of previous epidemics, and practical observation. Young Master Li, restricted to his quarters for protection, followed the developments with keen interest. During their abbreviated lessons, he peppered Wei with questions about the disease and the administrative response. "You've transformed the entire household in a matter of days," Li observed during one session. "My father's own officials couldn't have organized such a comprehensive response." Wei demurred. "I merely suggested approaches. Steward Zhao has been instrumental in implementation." "False modesty doesn't suit you, Teacher Wei," Li said with a hint of amusement. "The steward follows your directives while taking credit for them. I've watched the pattern." Wei changed the subject quickly, uncomfortable with Li's perceptiveness. The young man was observing the political maneuvering around him with increasing sophistication, a positive development for his future as an official, but potentially dangerous for Wei. By the 10th day of the crisis, the compound had recorded 15 cases of lung fever and 6 deaths, a devastating toll, but far better than the situation in the city, where entire neighborhoods were being ravaged. The magistrate's decision to establish a refugee camp outside the walls, with basic sanitation and food supplies, had indeed helped slow the spread of disease among the displaced population. Wei himself was exhausted, his body pushed to its limits by long days of organizing the response, while continuing Li's lessons and dealing with his own constant fear of infection. Without modern antibiotics, his main protection was prevention, and prevention required eternal vigilance. On the 12th day, disaster struck. Young Master Li, despite all precautions, developed a fever and cough. The magistrate summoned Wei immediately, his face ashen with fear and fury. "My son is ill," he said without preamble. "Your measures have failed." Wei felt the blood drain from his face. "Has the physician confirmed lung fever, Excellency?" "Not yet conclusively. The symptoms are similar but milder so far." The magistrate's voice was tight with controlled emotion. "You will attend him personally, Scholar Wei. Your fate is now tied directly to his." It was both a sentence and an opportunity. If Li died, Wei would likely be executed for failing to protect him. But by attending him directly, Wei could ensure that every possible precaution and treatment was employed. "I will not leave his side, Excellency," Wei promised. Li had been moved to an isolated wing of the family quarters, attended by 2 frightened servants who clearly expected him to die. When Wei arrived, the young man was conscious but feverish, his breathing labored. "Teacher Wei," Li said weakly, "have you come to continue my lessons even now? Your dedication is remarkable." Wei managed to smile as he approached the bed. "No lessons today, young master. Just rest and recovery." He examined Li carefully, noting with relief that while the symptoms were concerning, they didn't exactly match the pneumonic plague cases he had observed. The cough was less severe, the fever not as high, and there was no blood in the sputum. "It may not be the lung fever," Wei told the servants quietly, "but we will take every precaution as if it were." Over the next 3 days, Wei barely left Li's side, sleeping on a mat beside his bed. He insisted on cool compresses to control the fever, plenty of liquids, and a medicinal tea prepared by the compound's backup physician, an elderly woman whose knowledge of herbal remedies complemented Wei's focus on hygiene and isolation. The magistrate visited daily, standing at the doorway to observe his son's condition without entering the room. His face remained impassive, but the tightness around his eyes betrayed his fear. On the fourth day, Li's fever broke. His breathing eased, and his cough became productive, rather than dry and hacking. By the fifth day, he was sitting up and asking for proper food instead of rice porridge. "You saved my life, Teacher Wei," Li said as Wei helped him with a bowl of clear broth. Wei shook his head. "Your own strength saved you, young master, and I believe you had a different illness than the lung fever that has claimed so many others." Li studied him thoughtfully. "My father will reward you handsomely for this. Your position in this household is now secure." Wei nodded acknowledgement, but said nothing. Security in Imperial China was always relative and temporary, as he had learned repeatedly since his arrival. As Li predicted, the magistrate was effusive in his gratitude when his son was declared out of danger. Wei was presented with silver ingots, fine silks, and a formal letter of recommendation that would carry significant weight in scholarly circles. More importantly, the magistrate publicly named Wei as his son's primary tutor through the imperial examinations, a position that traditionally led to official appointments. The epidemic gradually subsided as winter approached. The city returned to its normal rhythms, though with hundreds fewer inhabitants. The refugee camp outside the walls slowly emptied, as people either found places within the city or returned to rebuild their flood-damaged villages. Within the magistrate's compound, Wei's status had been transformed by the crisis. From a questionable scholar of mysterious background, he had become a trusted advisor, valued for both his academic knowledge and his practical abilities in crisis management. As the prefectural examinations drew near, Wei focused intensely on Li's final preparation. The young man studied with new seriousness, perhaps influenced by his brush with mortality, or perhaps simply maturing into his role as a future official. On the day before Li departed for the examination city, he and Wei shared a final review session in the study pavilion. "I believe you are fully prepared, young master," Wei said as they finished. "Your essays show both technical mastery and genuine insight." Li nodded, unusually subdued. "Thanks to your guidance, but I find myself thinking beyond the examinations now." He looked up at Wei. "These past months, the refugees, the epidemic, they've shown me that governance is more than literary composition and classical illusions." "An important realization," Wei agreed. "The examination system selects for scholarly ability, but effective governance requires practical wisdom as well." "Like the wisdom you've demonstrated," Li said pointedly. "Teacher Wei, I've never directly asked about your background because I sensed you wished to keep certain matters private. But I want you to know that whatever your secrets may be, I consider you not just my tutor, but my friend." Wei was touched by this declaration. In the strictly hierarchical world of Imperial China, friendship across status boundaries was rare and valuable. "I am honored by your trust, young master," Wei replied sincerely. Li smiled. "When I return with my examination results, which will be successful, I assure you, I intend to recommend you for a position in the provincial administration. My father's influence, combined with the commissioner's interest in you, should be sufficient to secure an appointment." The offer represented everything Wei had worked toward since arriving in this world: security, status, and a path to potential influence. Yet, it also meant committing to a future in Imperial China, accepting that his modern life might truly be gone forever. "I would be grateful for your support," Wei said carefully. "But let us focus first on your examination success." The following day, Li departed for the prefectural capital with an escort of servants and guards appropriate to his status. The examinations would last 2 weeks, with results announced a month after completion. During this period, Wei continued his duties in the magistrate's household, primarily helping to organize the reconstruction efforts following the epidemic and floods. In the quiet evenings alone in his quarters, Wei reflected on how completely his understanding of Imperial China had been transformed by living within it. The academic history he had taught focused on systems, trends, and famous figures. It rarely captured the day-to-day terror of illness without modern medicine, the bone-deep exhaustion of physical labor without machines, or the constant psychological strain of navigating rigid hierarchies where a misstep could mean destruction. Nor had it adequately conveyed the complex humanity of the people who lived within these systems. People like young Master Li, struggling to balance filial duty with personal ambition. Like Foreman Lin, finding small ways to exercise compassion within restrictive structures. Or like the magistrate himself, bearing the impossible responsibility of representing imperial authority while managing local crises with limited resources. Wei had arrived in this world with knowledge but not understanding. Now he had both, at the cost of comforts, freedoms, and certainties he had once taken for granted. The messenger arrived 6 weeks after Li's departure, travel-stained, but carrying a letter sealed with the official mark of the Examination Bureau. The magistrate summoned his entire household to the main courtyard for the reading of the results. Wei stood with the senior servants, his heart pounding with anticipation. Li's success or failure would determine not just the young man's future, but Wei's own fate as well. The magistrate broke the seal and unfolded the letter, his expression giving nothing away as he read it silently first. Then he looked up, his face transformed by a rare, genuine smile. My son, Li Changpu, has achieved the rank of Gongshi, first-level scholar, placing third among all candidates in the prefectural examinations. The courtyard erupted in cheers and congratulations. Such a high ranking virtually guaranteed Li's acceptance into the provincial examinations, the next step toward the coveted Jinshi degree that opened doors to the highest levels of imperial service. As the celebration continued around him, Wei felt a complex mixture of emotions: pride in his student's achievement, relief at his own secured position, satisfaction at having successfully navigated the treacherous waters of elite society in Imperial China, but also a wistful sadness for the modern world he had left behind, with its greater freedoms and comforts, its scientific understanding and technological conveniences. Li returned to the compound 3 days later, welcomed with elaborate celebrations befitting his new status. When he and Wei finally had a moment alone in the study pavilion, the young scholar bowed deeply to his teacher, an unprecedented gesture from student to tutor that recognized Wei's essential role in his success. The provincial governor himself has taken notice of my examination performance, Li said excitedly. There is talk of a special appointment after the provincial examinations next year. You've earned such recognition, Wei replied with genuine pride. And you, Li continued, have earned the position we discussed. My father has already spoken to the commissioner. You are to be appointed as an instructor in the prefectural academy, a position that includes official rank and stipend. Wei bowed in acknowledgement of this life-changing news. From anonymous laborer to ranked official in less than a year, a transformation almost unheard of in the rigid social structure of Imperial China. There is one more thing, Li added, his expression turning serious. During the examinations, I met scholars from across the province, including several who had studied at the Imperial Academy in the capital. None had heard of your teacher, Master Huang of Henan. Wei tensed, sensing danger in this seemingly casual observation. In fact, Li continued, many aspects of your knowledge seem unusual. Your medical practices during the epidemic, for instance, were remarkably effective, yet unknown to our most experienced physicians. Wei remained silent, waiting for the accusation or demand that must follow. Instead, Li smiled slightly. Whatever your true origins, Teacher Wei, your knowledge and wisdom have benefited both me and this entire household. Your secrets remain your own. I ask only that you continue to share your unique perspective as I begin my career in governance. Relief washed over Wei. Li suspected, perhaps even knew, that Wei was not what he claimed to be, yet was offering protection rather than exposure. I will always offer my honest counsel, young master, Wei promised. Good. Li nodded with satisfaction. Because I believe the Empire needs men with new ideas, men who can see beyond tradition while respecting its foundations. He lowered his voice. Men, perhaps, with perspective from beyond our current understanding. In that moment, Wei realized he had found not just security in this ancient world, but purpose. His modern knowledge, carefully disguised as scholarly insight, might actually help improve lives in small but meaningful ways. Would he ever return to the 21st century? The question remained unanswered. But if this was now his permanent reality, Wei had carved out a place for himself, not just surviving, but potentially thriving in a world that had once existed for him only in historical texts. Imperial China remained a harsh realm of strict hierarchies, brutal punishments, precarious health, and limited freedoms. A modern person dropped into its realities would indeed struggle to survive even a single day without the knowledge, connections, and extraordinary luck that had favored Wei. Yet within these rigid structures, Wei had discovered the eternal human capacity for adaptation, for finding meaning in struggle, and for building connections across seemingly insurmountable divides of time and culture. As he and Li left the pavilion to join the ongoing celebration, Wei glanced up at the vast sky above the compound. The same sky that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties. The same sky that would one day look down on skyscrapers and satellites. For now, though, he lived firmly in the present moment of Imperial China. No longer a desperate stranger fighting for survival, but a man with a place, a purpose, and a path forward in a world both foreign and increasingly familiar. 5 years later, Wei stood on the banks of the Yangtze River, watching the imperial barges make their stately progress upstream. As an educational official in the provincial government, a position he had held for 3 years now, he was part of the welcoming delegation for a visiting censor from the capital. Beside him stood Li Changpu, no longer the reluctant student, but a rising star in the provincial administration. His success in the metropolitan examinations having opened doors to increasingly important appointments. Sometimes I wonder, Li said quietly as they watched the approaching vessels, if you miss the world you came from. It was the closest Li had ever come to directly acknowledging what he had clearly deduced years ago, that Wei was not of this time. Wei considered the question carefully. I miss certain comforts and conveniences, he admitted, but I found meaning here that I never expected. Li nodded thoughtfully. You've changed many lives through your unorthodox ideas. The new sanitation systems in the city, the reformed examination questions that test practical knowledge alongside classical learning, the expanded education for merchants' sons, all bear your influence, however carefully disguised. Wei smiled slightly. With your protection and support, young master, or should I say administrator Li. Li returned the smile. We make a good team, you and I, your knowledge and my position. He looked out at the river again. Whatever shore you came from originally, I'm grateful that fate or heaven brought you to this one. Wei followed his gaze across the broad waters of the Yangtze, the river where his journey had begun with that inexplicable drowning and awakening. Sometimes, in dreams, he returned to his modern life, with its electric lights and instant communications, its medical marvels and personal freedoms. But increasingly, those dreams felt distant and unreal compared to the life he had built here. "As am I," Wei replied finally. "As am I." Together, they turned to join the official welcoming party as the imperial barges drew near. Wei assumed his proper position in the hierarchy of officials, no longer an outsider struggling to survive, but a respected scholar official with connections and influence. Imperial China had not become easier or gentler in the years he had lived within it. It remained a world of strict social boundaries, ever-present physical hardships, and precarious security. A world where life could be lost to disease in days, where natural disasters meant starvation, where authority was absolute and often brutal. But it was also a world where Wei had found his place, building a bridge between ancient wisdom and more modern perspectives, between rigid tradition and practical innovation. A small bridge, visible to only a few trusted allies like Li, but perhaps strong enough to make some difference in the lives it touched. As the welcoming ceremonies began, Wei performed the required rituals with practiced ease, his body moving through the precise forms that had once seemed so foreign. The modern professor, who had struggled to survive his first day in Imperial China, had long since been transformed, not just outwardly in dress and manner, but inwardly in his understanding of a civilization he had once known only through texts. He had crossed between worlds and survived, carrying with him the knowledge of both, building connections across time that no one else could see, but that made all the difference in the lives around him. And in that bridging lay his true legacy, invisible to history, but nonetheless real. A modern soul who had found meaning in an ancient world, changing it in small but meaningful ways through his unique perspective. The imperial censor disembarked to elaborate the ceremony, unaware that among those welcoming him stood a man from centuries in the future, a living bridge between worlds that time and tradition had declared forever separate. Wei bowed with all the others, his mind at peace with his extraordinary fate.